Welcome to Post-Doom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm your host, Michael Dowd. And in this episode, I speak with a dear friend and colleague, John Halstead. John is the author of one of the most amazing little books, Another End of the World is Possible. And in this 52-minute conversation that was only recorded a month before coronavirus really took off here in the United States, recorded in February of 2020. Those of you listening to this will see, but you can't hear it. So audio, just know that John has written several profound posts on coronavirus since this was recorded. And the title that we've given this is Love at the End of Our World. It begins with two previews. How do you talk about it?
Well, I like post-doom. I liked using deep adaptation when I write about it. But in the family, I kind of tongue-in-cheek say the end of the world, right? And it sounds very dramatic. And I keep thinking, I need to stop saying that. And then but the more I think about it, I think, that is what I mean. It's not the end of the planet. It's not the end of nature. But in the sense that, we have a world, we make a world with our communities and our ideas and our, we make an order out of our chaos of our experience. And that, I think, is what's coming to an end. Yeah. When people have really traumatic experiences or like the death of a loved one, sometimes we say their world came to an end, like that centering, organizing factor or person in their life. But this is happening not on an individual level. It's happening to individuals, but it's happening on a collective scale now, a global scale now. So we're talking about an end of our world. I'm rediscovering my love of the land where I live, the place where I live. Yes. I'm cherishing my relationships at a whole new level. Yes. And I realized the despair, the depression, it's not a product of facing the truth. It's a product of the denial. Right? Yes. By holding on to this hope that we are something other than biological animals that are finite, holding on to some dream of infinite progress, that actually is what creates the despair and Absolutely. The depression. And it's when you're on the other side of it that I understand I would have said the same thing, but for people who are on this side of that despair, and I'm sure I'm going to cycle through periods of depression still, but on the other side of that awareness is actually a more profound and more real love for the world and for the people that we share it with. It really is.
The conversation begins. John, it's a delight to have you as part of this series because, as you know, we talked a couple weeks ago that I'm just gaga about your book, Another End of the World is Possible.
Thanks.
And for people who aren't familiar with you and haven't read your book, haven't read your blog, help us get you, like who you are, what you're committed to, what you're known for, or whatever.
Okay. Well, I often start by telling people where I live because it's significant for how things have developed for me. I live in Northwest Indiana, which is this odd place, really unique place. We moved here because I had a job offer and I had no idea what I was moving into. But we are right at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, which is close to Chicago. And the area is on the southern shore of Lake Michigan is one of the most ecologically diverse areas of the country. It's got dunes and forest and prairie and swamps. And if you stand on the beach and you look to your right, you see a coal-fired power plant. And then if you look to your left, you see this steel mill that's the largest producer of air pollution in our area. And then just beyond that is the BP refinery that is the largest tar sands refinery, refining tar sands from Alberta, Canada, in the country. And then there's a beautiful Chicago skyline a little bit further down. So it's this real contrast between hideous industrial civilization and beautiful wild nature, or what's semi-wild. So I got involved in activism, environmental activism, probably not too long ago. It was about 5 years ago, and I started. It was a little bit before this, but the big event for me was the Break Free campaign that was put on by 350.org. They were organizing 20 direct actions, or 20 actions involving civil disobedience around the world, all within like a week of each other. And one of them happened to be at the BP tar sands refinery that was just north of where I live. I really didn't know much before this where I was living and how significant this juncture was, because a lot of the oil for the country gets from Canada gets piped through this area. And I got arrested as part of that, and that kind of launched me into environmental activism. We organized a chapter of 350 in Indiana. And before this, I'd been, I'm a self-identified Unitarian Universalist, but I'm also a pagan. And I had, a little bit before this, kind of come to the conclusion that, one of the reasons I got into paganism was an interest in a religion that I thought would have an ecologically centered attitude. And I was kind of frustrated that I didn't see a lot of actual activism among pagans.
And I just want to note that you are naturalistic pagan or humanistic pagan or ecological pagan, but it's you and John Host are two of the main voices, as I see it, for a science-based interpretation of neo-paganism.
Yeah, and that was another reason why I kind of ended up butting heads with a lot of pagans, because I have a more natural, as you said, naturalistic, not supernaturalistic orientation toward religion, which makes me fit in well with you Unitarian Universalists. But anyway, so I was looking for a more grounded, more a spirituality more connected to the earth, and that kind of led me to activism. And one of my interests is really about tying or connecting spirituality and activism, and finding the meeting ground there. So and then eventually through trying to save the world, I eventually came to the kind of a post-doom, as you're calling it, the post-doom orientation, where I went through a period where I was wrestling with real actually despair and depression, and kind of pushed through to the other side, I think, I'm hoping, and now I'm feeling out this area that's kind of beyond hope and despair. And that's what the book is about.
Yes. Yeah, it's a quick read. Anybody listening to this, it's under 100 pages. I think it's like 88 pages or something like that. And it's just an absolutely fabulous read, because it's 4 or 5 posts that you had done, rather lengthy, and put them together in a book form. And as I shared with you in a previous conversation, there were a few dozen times in the course of reading it that I had the thought, that's like exactly how I'd language it, or, except I experience you as a better writer than me. Fortunately, I'm married to a world-class editor, so my writing appears to be better than it actually is. But yeah.
Well, and I thought I was discovering this on my own, and then I fortunately, partly through you and through other people, discovered there's more and more people that are coming to this place and talking about it and creating communities around it. It's great. It's great.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to want to ask you, you've got a family, so you've
Right.
got skin in the game, as they say.
It's been, and I don't have any answers for this, but it has been challenging. I have a 21-year-old son and a 17-year-old daughter, and they are just starting to move out into the world and begin they're on the verge of independence, some level of independence, and they're more clear-eyed about these issues than I am. I mean, my daughter was telling me about a conversation he was having with a friend the other day and they were talking about, like, where do you want to be when you are such and such age, and I can't remember what it was. And her friend, who incidentally is Mormon, turned to her and said, well, that's very optimistic of you to think that the world's going to be around in 50 years. And, what does that do to a teenager to live with that awareness,
Yes.
and we're talking about, I think even youth who aren't completely, immersed in what we're talking about here are on some level, they're hearing about climate change. They're hearing about, catastrophic news, and to live with that awareness, I'm surprised that, we're not all in,
Yeah, I think we're in
permanent
the early
therapy. I'm just,
yeah,
wow.
exactly. I think we're in the early stages of the greatest mental health crisis in human history. And it will be a global phenomenon. Different cultures will deal with it differently. But one of the things I loved about your book, Another End of the World is Possible, is you really featured in a way that deserves to be featured, or at least this is my interpretation of it, was that truly embracing your own mortality and our species' mortality is perhaps the best antidote to despair and long-term depression. I mean, obviously feeling grief, if you have a heart of compassion, you're going to feel grief. That's healthy. That's normal. That's natural. That, as Joanna Macy often says, that helps us know that we love, because we wouldn't be feeling grief if we didn't love. And
Exactly.
It also helps us know how profoundly interrelated and interconnected we are with other life forms. And so grief's a good thing. I don't ever want to be away, beyond that. But
Right.
the kind of debilitating despair and depression and overwhelm and, if you truly embrace that you're going to die, I'm going to die, and that we're probably going to die, and our kids and grandkids are probably going to die a lot sooner than they would have, say, 50 or 100 years ago. So I found your book so, like, where I was like the amen choir or chorus, was when you really regularly came back to the embrace of mortality,
Right.
as vital for helping to maintain some sense of being sane, sober, and inspired in contracting, collapsing times.
Yeah. When I was talking to Patrick Farnsworth about this, he said he had this conversation and with someone else, and this question would circulate of, well, if you feel that way like we do, why don't you just kill yourself, right? Like, this has got to be such a depressing state of mind, right? But no, it's actually not.
No,
It's
it's not.
incredible. It's, like you said, it's joyful. I'm rediscovering my love of the land where I live, the place
Yes.
where I live.
Yes.
I'm cherishing my relationships at a whole new level.
Yes.
And the I realized the despair, the depression, it's not a product of facing the truth. It's a product of the denial, right?
Yes.
By holding on to this hope that we are something other than biological animals that are finite, holding on to some dream of infinite progress, that actually is what creates the despair and the
Absolutely.
depression. And it's when you're on the other side of it that I understand I would have said the same thing, but for people who are on this side of that despair, and I'm sure I'm going to cycle through periods of depression
Sure.
still,
Yeah.
but on the other side of that awareness is actually a more profound and more real love for the world and for the people that we share it with. It really is. It's amazing.
I
Um,
I 100% agree. And before I ask you to share your story in more length or more depth, what about the language? Like, does post doom? What does that ring for you, if anything? What language do you tend to use for these crazy, contracting, challenging times? And how do you talk about it?
Well, I like post-doom. I liked using deep adaptation when I write about it. But in the family, I kind of tongue-in-cheek say the end of the world, right? And it sounds very dramatic. And I keep thinking, I need to stop saying that. And then but the more I think about it, I think, that is what I mean. It's not the end of the planet. It's not the end of nature, but in the sense that, we have a world, we make a world with our communities and our ideas and our, we make an order out of our chaos of our experience. And that, I think, is what's coming to an end.
Yeah.
When people have really traumatic experiences or like the death of a loved one, sometimes we say their world came to an end, like that centering, organizing factor or person in their life. But this is happening not on an individual level. I'm just happening to individuals, but it's happening on a collective scale now, a global scale now. So we're talking about the end of our world. That's how I've been talking about it with my family.
Yeah. Well, I've been trying to think of mythic or playful ways of languaging, this for myself as well. And I see myself kind of in the lineage or in the archetypal patterning of sort of a shamanic or perhaps chaplain of the post-doom clan of the Teotihuacan tribe. And Teotihuacan being the end of the world as we know it.
I'll have to remember that. Thank you. Teotihuacan.
So the heart of this particular podcast series has been me inviting my various guests to speak about their journey, their story, what their worldview was like growing up. Most of us, not all, I've discovered, but most of us had an expectation of perpetual progress. We had an expectation that things would get better and better. And that shifted. And for some of us, that was traumatic and dramatic. And there were significant downturns and times that we dealt with depression or came close to suicide or whatever. So anything and everything that you'd like to share based on sort of what it was like for you growing up, how things shifted, what were any major books or events or resources, and then, what resources have helped you keep, for the most part, sane, sober, and inspired in the midst of craziness?
Depends who you ask, right? Okay. Well, I was raised Mormon. It's something that people sometimes find interesting. And I think it's relevant to this discussion because Mormons believe in a principle called eternal progression. And it's the idea that human beings will evolve and develop over millennia, in the afterlife, and eventually, and they get mocked for this, but become gods, right? Or become godlike. And so this idea of infinite progress, the infinite possibility of human potential was baked into me from a very, very early age. And I left the Mormon church when I was about 25, and soon after, considered myself a Christian for a while, and then I became an atheist, and then discovered paganism. But so I had to wrestle with that loss of a sense of future for myself, and the embrace the idea that this life is finite for me, and that was a process for me. And I do remember one experience in particular. I just had this. It was a mystical experience where I felt myself really connected to humanity, and I was able to let go of this kind of fear of death, because I thought, well, humanity will carry on. We'll always, progress and evolve, and I won't survive, but I'm a part of this greater thing, this greater chain of it's the the big history, the universe story,
right?
And but it was still very human centric, and so I was very proud of myself for like coming to terms with my own death, and then later, after I came to believe that our civilization and possibly our species, well, eventually, no matter what, our species has got to come to an end. So coming to terms with that was like coming to terms with my own death all over again. And now I'm doing it in front of my children who are in their teens and wrestling with their own angst. And having to deal with that was a struggle. But I guess I'm jumping way ahead. The kind of the moment when my decline started was almost the moment when I started becoming involved in activism. I was at that rally at BP and was getting ready to be arrested, and Bill McKibben from 350 had come to speak, and I'd never seen him before, and I was so excited. And near the end of his speech, he said, "We're not going to stop global climate change. It's too late for that." And I remember having this like double take moment, like, what did he say? Did anybody else hear him say that? I'm getting ready to get arrested to go stop climate change, right? To save everything. I'm going to save the world. And I couldn't process it at that point. I was just like, I don't know. And so I put it on the back burner of my brain, and it sat there for several years while I organized with 350 and busied myself. Now I look back and I realize I was busying myself, I think, largely in part to avoid facing that question, right? And which I think is common. Yeah. And I can't recall when the crack exactly opened, but I do remember the idea. It was, I had read something about energy return on investment, and it was comparing the how much energy you can get after the energy that it takes to produce it out of renewable energy versus fossil fuels, and it's like it's an order of magnitude different. Same thing for nuclear and all the other alternative energies that are being promoted. And it just hit me like, oh wow, so we can't keep going on the way we're going on even if we switch to renewable energy. And then I was looking back at years of activism, and thinking about our push, always saying we just switch to renewables, and everything will be okay. And that all kind of collapsed for me. And then it was a rabbit hole from that point on. I quickly realized that it's not really even just a climate change issue. Even if climate change weren't an issue, we were talking about just some basic physical principles of physics, and we're hitting numerous natural limits, and we've basically been living off of this this glut of energy from that took hundreds of millions of years to create, and it's now on its decline. For all intents and purposes, we're over the peak, and so there, yeah, we're headed toward how does Jem Bendell put it? It's certain collapse, probable catastrophe, and possible extinction. Right. That's kind of how I've come to it.
Yeah, that's the piece that is so difficult for most of us to get our heads and especially our hearts and our guts around, which is, based on the work of William Catton, we now understand this fundamental predicament that we are living within, which is that we actually live in a world where we have carrying capacity, ecological term, carrying capacity deficit. We don't have enough resources, enough energy to support anything near 7.5, 8 billion people. And yet we have shipped all over the world carrying capacity surplus expectations. So we're living in a carrying capacity deficit world. We have carrying capacity surplus expectations and institutions, because those were largely founded here in North America, over the course of the last 300 years. And that mismatch is huge. And most of us, when we come to finally accept that we're looking at a future of less and less, right, not more and more, and that with that, in the wake of that, all other kinds of things contract and collapse, as every previous contracting civilization, city-based, human-centered civilization has, then that's the ugh. That's the like, oh shit, or oh my God, or that's what I'm meaning by doom, is that emotional experience,
right,
of wow, we're fucked. And then ultimately, hopefully, some of us at least get to, that's why I've started why I'm doing this series, is that for many of us on the other side of that, we come to find the gift. We realize that unsustainable civilizations are always at some point not sustained. And actually, the quicker that Homo colossus goes extinct, the better possibility there might be, assuming we don't have total nuclear meltdown of our power plants and stuff like that. You know, the more likely or possible that that some Homo sapiens, especially those that still have an indigenous heart and mind, can survive.
Right. So as I'm realizing this, I'm starting to feel that, you know, that sinking feeling and the weight of it. And I recognized it. I'd read enough to recognize it as, you know, like environmental or climate grief or whatever people are calling it. And then I had a personal tragedy in my life that it wasn't a death, but I kind of experienced it like a death. And the combination of those things just sent me into this darker place than I've ever been before.
Yeah.
And I'm actually, the more I've listened to people tell stories, there's several people I've heard that have said that they realized this around the same time that they had a personal tragedy in their life, like the loss of a loved one or something. Darja Mail, somebody that comes to mind. Yeah. And but anyway, so, and there's a similarity there. You know, you're realizing the limitations of everything, and so that was definitely a difficult time, and that was recent. That was maybe a year and a half ago, and pushing through to kind of a better equilibrium and a place, like say, post doom, beyond not hoping that things are going to stay the same exactly, not a hopeful frame of reference, but not a despairing one either. More realistic, and trying to think about, okay, this is the situation. What's the best way to respond?
Yeah, my sense of that's sort of the basic spiritually mature perspective in all traditions is accepting what's real, processing whatever feelings you have around that, and then moving out from that in a place of possibility. It's kind of like, okay, here's what's real. All right, now what's possible? And sort of being in that place.
And it requires, because we're a culture that like wants answers. Fix it now. And it's my personality too. I'm like, I see a problem, I want to fix it. And but this place requires, at least from me, waiting and patience and being open and receptive and listening. And it's hard to talk about that with my activist community, who's very focused on action. Even if people are sometimes very explicit that some action, even if completely ineffective, is better than no action, you know?
Right.
And I don't think that's true so much anymore.
Well, Connie uses a body metaphor, and I find it useful. She holds her arm down like this, slanted down. And she said, you know, if you're up here and you're an activist and you genuinely believe that if we just do the right things or get enough people to do the right things or vote the right way or, you know, whatever it may be, then this can be avoided, or at least some of this can be avoided, then you're going to really resent and resist people that are like way down here who are saying, no, it's too late for that, because you will actually find it problematic that they're saying that, because then they're going to discourage people from being effective up here. It just so makes sense of human nature. You know, it's interesting. Connie and I both have noticed several times we've had to downshift what we can feel good about. Like it used to be, well, at least some humans will survive. Exactly. And then over the last 7 years, we've realized, oh, that one can't be taken for granted. It might be that some humans survive for the next 1 million or 2 million years before a super volcano or, you know, asteroid or something takes us out, but we're not likely to last more than that, and there's a very decent possibility that we don't last this century. So I had to find something. Well, okay, at least trees. Connie's about assisting trees in migrating north, and And the truth of the matter is, anything you can do on behalf of any life form beyond human is holy work. It's sacred work. Building topsoil, moving trees, assisting them in migrating faster, poleward,
Right.
faster than any other animal. And then we realized, damn, things could wig out so severely in terms of abrupt climate change and the Arctic and everything else. If things, if you've got a situation where we've got 6-7 degrees Celsius rise within a few years, you're looking at most trees not being able to survive. So then we had to downshift a little bit further. Well, okay, what can we confidently say based on billions of years of evolution are likely to make it no matter how severe? So we thought of tardigrades. Tardigrades are like, wow, they're damn near indestructible. So moss, ferns, and tardigrades. So we're really confident that no matter how bad things get, they'll last. So we can feel good about that. So it's sort of a downshifting of expectation. One of the things I'd like to ask you is, how do you hold sort of our science-based epic of evolution, big green history or deep time or whatever you want to call it, but our common creation myth that unites us as all people, but also unites us with the larger body of life? How do you think about the big picture in ways that serve you in dealing with and coping with and living a life and being a father and that sort of thing?
Sure. Yeah. So for a while, I still saw human beings as in some way exceptional. When I had accepted that, yeah, there's not an afterlife and I'm going to come to an end. But I believe that human beings, through ingenuity and we're so smart, right, that we were going to, we're unique in some way. And so I embrace this idea of, yes, we've evolved over millennia and over eons into human beings, but I still had this kind of very, very Mormon, idea of human beings still being human beings eons from now. And this is, realizing that civilizations come to an end and species come to an end, and that's just the natural order of things, with or without climate change. That's put a check on that for me, and now I realize, yeah, human beings are going to come to an end, and eventually life on Earth will come to an end as well. It's all part of the epic of evolution, and death is as much a part of that story as life. And that's something that paganism really, that drew me to paganism, and something that actually helped me through my depressive period was, there's this myth for neo-pagans. It's called the myth of the dying god. And there's all kinds of stories about dying gods in various pagan religions, and in Christianity is an example, where there's a god who's born so often at the winter solstice, and then eventually dies and is reborn, and usually dies at the time when for us it would be autumn time, and then reborn again in the winter, and or sometimes in the spring, depending on how you want to tell the story. And the message of these myths is that death is part of life, and that we have to, on some level, embrace it. And fighting against it, denying it, leads to us being out of harmony with nature. And I think that's what it's just exactly what's happened to our society. We're a very death-denying society, right? And we look to technology and to our ingenuity and all kinds of things to distract us from or defeat death in some way. And Ernest Becker says that basically civilization is a giant death denial project, right? It's a giant immortality project. And so reminding myself, both through the stories and also through rituals, of the importance of accepting the death part of this cycle has been helpful. So there's this one book that really, I think, pushed me in this direction. It was called The Wizard and the Prophet by Charles Mann.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
he talks about two visions of our relationship with the universe, or we're going to start with nature. And one is the prophet who says, no, he says we need to live within limits. Human beings need to learn within live within limits. That means reducing our population, consuming less. And the wizard says, no, we can, we're ingenious creatures. We can figure our way out of any limitation, and limitations exist to be broken. And at the beginning and the end of the book, he's got
go ahead and name the two figures that was based on.
Yeah, Norman Borlaug and Vogt. Okay, yeah, and so those are the two like archetypal characters, and he goes through and gives examples of both of these kinds of thinking and in various realms, and from energy to how we manage our water and food. A big part of it's about food production. But at the beginning and the end of the book, he talks about Lynn Margulis, who's somebody who he knew personally, who presented a third vision. And it's because both the wizard and the prophet believe we can be saved if we just either, invest in science or scale back. And she says, no, human beings are great and all, but we're essentially the same as bacteria. And bacteria will consume if you put them in a petri dish, they will consume all of the agar that's in the petri dish until they hit the boundary, and then they will die in their own waste. And that's what most species do. There's a few exceptions, but most species will do this eventually. And so from her perspective, this overshoot is inevitable, right? In our case, it was greatly accelerated because we discovered fossil fuels. But it's inevitable that we're going to do this, and that is really humbling because we're essentially no different than bacteria. That is truly humbling for somebody who believed not only that in the unlimited potential of human civilization, but at one time believed that we could become godlike. So I think that kind of our current, the popular worship of science and technology. I'm a rationalist. Even my religion is I try to be science based, but the worship of science and technology is just another form of kind of this belief that we can become gods. Like we don't have limits. So that's the definition of a god, is a being that does not have limitations, right?
Yeah, one of the things that I've made a avocational passion of mine in the last 7 years is studying not just the rise and fall of civilization and what are some of the common dynamics. And John Michael Greer has popularized people like Toynbee and Spengler and Vico and others that have really spent a lifetime, a career, focusing on that. What are the common dynamics of collapse and that sort of thing.
Right.
But also, he's one of the more profound and articulate critiquers of the notion of progress, certainly human-centered progress. One of the videos that I've created that I feel best about is a thing called Sane versus Insane Progress. And it's a little 22-minute Pinker takedown video that really shows that the idea that you can have human progress and everything that humans depend on is in precipitous free fall is, this does not take rocket science to realize that that's not sustainable, that's not going to end well. And so that's why the ecological worldview has become so foundational. I've said often in these programs that, if you only read one more book the rest of your life, I encourage people to read William Catton's book, Overshoot. Yeah. Because he provides, in many ways, Vogt was really an early William Catton. He really articulated and spoke from this deeply ecological understanding of the way life actually works and the laws with which humans have to live within that context for us to sustain. That's why I also love Edward Goldsmith's work. So,
one of the problems with communicating this message is, you and I and most of the people who are writing and talking about this are coming from a very privileged background. We're living in,
Yes.
the Western world, and we've lived very privileged lives. And we're saying, and we're saying, not, the rest of the world will never be able to live like this, and we've been this country in the West has basically, Catton talks about this, about, we've basically been feeding off of the Southern Hemisphere and poorer countries for centuries, and now we're turning around and saying, oh, and the promise was always eventually you'll catch up, right? And now the message of the doom community and the post-doom community is, no, we're not. We're all going to head downhill from here.
Yeah, and the closer you are to subsistence level now, you'll be able to make it better than those of us that are dependent upon vast supply chains.
Isn't that true? Yes. Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Well, anything that you'd like to say about human nature? I've got the way that we wrote the question. This is, how does your sense of inborn human strengths and limitations, sort of our evolved nature and mismatched instincts, affect your interpretation of our societal and cultural deterioration? That is, do you have the sense that this descent could have been avoided, or do you think that it was in some way inevitable? Or maybe you feel that such if-only speculation is irrelevant now.
This is my working theory, so I'm open to being persuaded otherwise. But I tend to think that human beings, like most other species, will always push up against their limits of their natural limits, and whether a species survives depends on how we react to that moment. I think there's this tendency with indigenous peoples to idolize them. There's this what do we call it? The myth of the ecologically noble savage. There are societies that have lived more sustainably than we have, but I tend to think that they learned it the hard way. That the ecological wisdom that indigenous people have today is the product of millennia and tens of millennia of learning the hard way, bumping up against those limits and finding out, oh, whoa, we're running out of food, or we're running out of this thing.
Yeah, that's what natural selection does, is it winnows out unsuccessful strategies for survival and reproduction. And that goes for cultures too. Especially, in fact, it goes especially for cultures, for populations.
It takes more than a generation to learn these lessons.
Oh, yeah, it's coming up against those limits.
Right.
So I tend to find Teddy Goldsmith and Richard Adrian Reese, his writings on what is sustainable, certainly Paul Shepard, his amazing work, and Dolores LaChapelle. I mean, these are the major mentors for me of my ecological understanding, and exactly as you're saying, the hard-won ecological wisdom often came as a result of failures to live ecologically and then dealing with the consequences.
Right, and that takes generations and generations.
Right.
But we have over 200 years about, since we started really using fossil fuels in the way that we have, we've created this situation, and I don't think we've had time to learn the hard lesson. So I feel like we were given Prometheus fire or whatever, this gift we were not ready to use, and it's damned us. So because of human nature, I think we can learn. I think there's evidence that human beings can adapt and live sustainably, but I don't think we have time to, given how rapidly we have screwed things up. So.
Yeah, my mythic way of holding this comes out of Avatar. The scene in Avatar where the Colonel, talking about blowing up the Tree of Souls,
Great tree. Mm-hmm.
that it will create a crater in their racial memory so deep that they will never go within 200 clicks of that ever again. I believe that the collapse of global industrialism will be the crater in our racial memory that, should any human survive this bottleneck, and I think there's a pretty decent chance that at least pockets of humans will, but should any of us survive, the collapse of industrialism will be mythologized in so many different ways, but they will all basically make the same point. we don't do that again, ever.
Right.
And it will be the biggest learning. And, and the selection pressures, of course, will then be not the most energy wasteful will succeed. No, the most energy conserving, and groups of people, group selection. That's why I love David Sloan Wilson's work. But the groups that live ecologically and are kind and generous and loving and supportive of each other, a strong in-group, will outcompete other groups who
Right.
live less ecologically or who have, bitterness and fighting and, whatever. So my hope is that this will be that crater. This will be the catastrophic failure of anthropocentrism. And at all costs, human-centeredness will never be tried again because it doesn't work. It self-destructs.
I hope so.
Yeah, it's a vision that wakes me up. It's a preachable vision. Let's put it that way.
And we can plant the seeds of that
Exactly.
in ways now. So yeah.
Exactly. Well, in winding this down, I just want to ask you, so what's your sense of what's beyond our control, but what may still be possible?
I went to go see the movie Anthropocene a few months ago. It's very little narration, and it's just images mostly of some of the most massive industrial projects on the planet and their waste. And I walked out of there thinking, there's no way we're going to stop this, right? It is out of our control. We no longer have our hands on the levers of this thing. It's got a life of its own. I am still ambivalent about discouraging people from whatever form of activism they're involved in. Mm-hmm. So, if people are fighting for renewable energy, whatever you're doing, I think it's great. I think it could possibly knock some degrees off of that inevitable rise in global temperatures. So great. But I think it's all ultimately doomed to failure. And so for me, I am turning my attention to more very small scale things. I'm interested in, this is going to sound pathetically small, but I mean, I have to get down to this level to, I think it's important to get down to this level. I'm starting with rewilding my yard. I want to know and understand the ground between, and have a relationship with the ground beneath my feet. That's not domineering. And start from there and build out. Start with the relationships with the people that I'm closest to, and investing. Because I'll tell you, when I was at my height of my activism, I was not giving a lot of attention to my family. It was other relationships were suffering in my drive to save the planet, right? And so honestly, I don't know what is possible at this point. I want to grow more of my own food. I want to, and not so much so that we can survive the end times, but just because it's, I don't know, it feels like the right thing to do at this point.
It's
grow more
communing
food.
with in my language, it's communing with the Holy of Holies. It's communing with our material creator, sustainer, and end, nature, life.
And I want to do it. And I want to do it in community.
Yes, exactly.
There's somebody who lives near me in Gary, Indiana, who she and her husband bought a house, and they started regenerative agriculture over their whole plot, and started a community food garden in their front yard. Well, it was awesome. But of course, the city was like, no, you can't be doing this. It attracts rodents or whatever. And so she's had a legal battle over this thing. And she lives in a food desert. She's growing food for her neighbors. And it's amazing. And I want she's a example for me, and somebody that I would hold up and follow. So I don't know where exactly this is going to lead. I'm starting a grief group, a couple grief groups actually in two parts of the county, where people, and I'm intentionally, my instinct is like invite everybody, but I'm intentionally keeping those small, like 5 people because you can't have a conversation with like more than 5 people. It turns into some other dynamic. So I'm doing this real small group, and it goes against all my instincts because I still have that activist mentality of like, how's this going to save the world? It's not. Relax, breathe.
Yes.
What matters is our relationships and the present, and but I don't want to discourage people that aren't there yet. Who I think you have to kind of work your way.
Yes.
Work your way there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I fully align with everything you just said, and I too find that when I'm encouraging people to move through whatever stages of grief, whatever they need to move through, and then ultimately come to the place, which is really my last question to you, is in coming to terms with the cascading problems of overshoot, resource depletion, climate breakdown, etc. Have you encountered stages of grieving that went beyond mere acceptance? Like what opened up for you positively on the other side? What Paul Chafurka calls finding the gift.
Well, I was really reticent to use this word before because it sounds so, I don't know, flighty, but love is just the thing that I keep coming back to. It's the love for the place where I am, and the love for the people, and the non-human people that I share this place with. And so I keep coming back to that. And I told you I'm an atheist, and my religion is I think more rationalistic than people normally think of religion as, but I have rediscovered prayer, and I'm still the rationalist in me is still a little embarrassed. I'm actually blushing right now to talk about this, but prayer for me has become the act of just acknowledging my limitations and opening up to possibility, that things that I can't control, right? Acknowledging what I can't control and opening up to whatever the future is going to bring. And I don't know what I'm praying to, and I don't really care what I'm praying to. The act of praying and in its most simple form, in my darkest moments, my prayer is just help me, just help. Somebody said there's like 3 basic prayers: help, thank you, wow, and something else.
Yeah.
And in my most amazing spiritual moments, they've been these wow and thank you. And in my darkest, and they were prayers, even though I don't believe in God as a literal God. And in my darkest moments, it's just been help, please help.
Yes.
And I have felt something help me in those
Yes.
moments. And I can rationalize and explain where it comes from or whatever, but it doesn't matter because it's working,
Well, I see prayer and define prayer as the posture and attitude of humility and gratitude.
There you go.
The posture and attitude of, because that to my mind, the humble stance, the stance of relating to primary reality as primary, and that we are dependent, we are derivative. Yes. That is so fundamental. And I would actually challenge you. You're not a fucking atheist. You're an eco-theist. No, seriously, you're an eco-theist. For your ecos is divine.
Right.
The biosphere is divine. And it's not about believing in it. You don't believe in the ecosphere. You just live in right relationship to it or you suffer. So I'm offering you a new term. You're actually, the theist-atheist debate is still locked in this ecocidal understanding of religion as it's about beliefs. And I say, I do everything I can to hit both theism and atheism as hard as I can and say that debate is precisely why we're in the mess we are, because religion, if it's doing its job, is ensuring that the future is never compromised by the present. That's what Teddy Goldsmith actually defines religion as: the control mechanism of stable, sustainable cultures.
Wow.
It's that which insists on limits. And belief-based religions don't do that. And so I'm neither a theist nor an atheist. I'm an eco-theist.
Our religions aren't doing their job then.
Yeah, well, that's true. I mean, they really aren't. That's in part what his entire book, The Stable Society, was about, was taking a look at the anthropological research over the last 500-600 years about what's the difference between sustainable, pro-future, life-centered, ecocentric societies, cultures, and often won through hard-won difficulties, as you said, and unsustainable cultures, anti-future cultures, human-centered cultures that tend to overshoot and experience a collapse.
Right.
So, well, anything you'd like to say in bringing this to conclusion?
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk. I love talking to you, and I love the work you're doing. So this is a real honor for me.
Cool. Well, it's an honor for me too, brother. This has been a post-doom conversation. For more audios and videos of post-doom conversations and other resources along these lines, go to postdoom.com.